Hello and welcome to Ullapool. Well, sadly, not Ullapool, but my house. Um, I'm going to guess that, like you and me and everybody else, we've been looking forward to over the last year, focusing throughout this pandemic, this terrible pandemic year, on the second weekend of May, and that pivotal time for all of us, the Ullapool Book Festival. And sadly, both last year and this year, that hasn't happened, and that's why I'm not there. I have to say, as this welcome address from the honorary president of the Ullapool Book Festival, I have to say my honorary presidency must be the most troubled and troublesome in the entire UBF history. However, I think that even given the fact that we can't be together this year in Ullapool, doesn't mean to say that we're not going to have a fantastic celebration of books and reading and a great Ullapool Book Festival. I mean, in a sense, writers and readers weren't really supposed to be together. I mean, it's all about what's so fascinating, that we can read people from many, many miles away and many, many centuries apart and still feel a connection. Right now, I'm working on a text in Satire of the Three Estates, written 470 years ago, and yet I feel this connection with David Lindsay. But in Ullapool, we do love being together. We do love walking around the streets of Ullapool and going down to the Cayley Place and of course the Scones and chatting about who we've listened to and what we've heard. And in a sense, I think that can keep on going. And in one sense, better even than usual. This is going to be another great Ullapool Book Festival. Joan and the team have gone out their way to make it as Ullapool as possible, and it's as rich and as deep and as varied as it always is. There's Gaelic poetry, there's music, there's poetry from Ayrshire, there's crime from today, the here and now, and from the Victorian era. There's travel writing, there's political writing, there's history. There's all those conversations that we have every year in Ullapool about who we are, where we've been and where we're going. And this year, although we don't have that one special weekend in the second weekend of May, we are going to be together every Wednesday night, right through spring, right through summer into August. So in one sense, that's really, really special. And I'm kind of so looking forward to all that. And this is quite a special spring and summer, hopefully at the end of which the world will look in a more recognisable shape and we can look forward to 2022.
Hello and welcome to the Ullapool Book Festival 2021. My name's James Robertson and I'm delighted to be hosting this event where I'll be talking to Linda Cracknell. And I should say that we're doing this event from the Cayley Place in Ullapool. It's a beautiful sunny day outside and the hotel is open and the place is humming outside. So there may be a few extraneous noises in the course of this recording, so don't worry, that's all that's going on. Life is going on outside. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Linda Cracknell to you. Linda's somebody I've known for a long time as a fellow writer. She is a novelist, a short story writer, a playwright, writing a lot of plays for radio, a writer of non-fiction, and a teacher of creative writing. She's published 2 books of short stories, Life Drawing and The Searching Glance. She published a novel called Call of the Undertow, and she also has written a work of non-fiction called Doubling Back, 10 Walks Trodden in Memory, which is a really fascinating book, which I'm sure we'll refer to in the course of this conversation. But today, mostly we're going to be talking about her new novel, The Other Side of Stone, which was published in March this year. So it's a very new book and it's been incredibly well received in the short time that it's been out on sale. So welcome, Linda.
Thank you very much.
Let's have a chat about The Other Side of Stone. quite apart from the fact that it's a very handsome publication, which I hope people can see, it's a beautifully produced hardback. And we'll talk a wee bit about how that all came about. But it's quite a short book, but it's been a long time in the writing. So I wondered if we could maybe start, if you could say a wee bit about how the book came to be and how long it came to be and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it's just slightly embarrassing that it's taken 20 years from when I began it. But the sequence of events was that I had a book, my first book of short stories, Life Drawing. After that came out, which was 2000, I made an application to what was then the Scottish Arts Council for a bursary, and I was successful. And what people had been saying to me since the publication of the short stories was, well, great, that's all very well, but nobody will take any notice of you as a writer unless you write a novel. And I think I'd found my form in the short story, but I did think, all right, okay, better go and write a novel, because that's what everyone's saying. So the impulse wasn't, oh, I've got this idea and this character and this place that feels novel shaped or length. It was like, oh God, I've got to write a novel.
Isn't that strange? Because we get, as writers, we get told that, especially when we're early on in our careers, so often. And so often we all cut our teeth on writing short stories, and then we're told, yeah, but now you've got to do the grown up thing.
Yes, exactly.
Which is, I think, does a huge disservice to a lot of writers, and particularly to that form, the short story, which is, when it's done well, is so brilliant.
Yes, and I think it was quite a big diversion for me. Yeah. And I'm not sorry that I started it, but it was like, okay, what's the novel going to be about, you know? And then I came up with the initial impulse was actually a contemporary story set in a building with a history, and I always envisaged it as an industrial building, but I hadn't decided what. Actually, I think my first idea was that it was going to be an ex-hydroelectric station.
Okay.
I think that, which had been converted into flats. And the notion was a sort of ruptured relationship and an illness which somehow seemed to be connected to the history of the building. But I didn't know what the history of the building was at that stage. So I was concentrating on a couple who the male partner of whom was a young architect, very ambitious, and he had this sort of great idea about this state-of-the-art conversion he was going to make into luxury flats. It quite quickly became established as a woolen mill in my mind, partly because I knew quite a bit about mill, particularly the woolen industry and mills. And I thought, actually, that is a really interesting setting. And because in Perthshire, there were one particular mill that I was thinking of, but I knew that there had been isolated mills, nothing like the Borders. But
and you were living in Perthshire.
And I still live in Perthshire. But it was, I knew, actually, in the place that I live, Aberfeldy, there's still a working tweed mill. Most people don't know that, even people who live there, but there is.
Which is pretty unusual these days.
Yes, and it's not doing much, but it's still producing tweeds.
Right.
Anyway, so the initial impulse was this contemporary story, but with a kind of root in a building which wasn't entirely comfortable, but for an undisclosed reason. And I thought, well, I'm going to have to know what the reason is. So I started hunting around for an underlying history of something that had happened, and I think it was actually Brian McCabe who'd suggested that I looked at industrial unrest. He was at the time writer-in-residence in the Suter House in Perth, and so I did some historical research in old copies of the Perthshire Advertiser and came across, obviously in the kind of Red Clydeside period, all that industrial unrest that was going on right across Scotland at that time. There was lots of material there, but also came across a history of a rural Perthshire suffragette. And out of that came the background for another character in that previous period. And then she demanded to have a voice of her own, and that took over. And I never, for the purposes of a novel, I never quite managed to marry the two time periods and get them adding up to a sort of an overall meaning, which is why that novel got dumped.
So that's, we're talking about what, early 2000s?
Yes, I started in 2001. I think it probably got properly dumped in about 2005.
I find that really fascinating because I think, again, most of us as writers have been in that place where you work away at something and for some reason it doesn't work in the format. Something has not, you haven't got something right and you don't know quite what it is.
Yes.
And eventually you lay it aside. But then obviously you must have come back to it because it's some of the elements that you've just described are present
Still there.
in this book.
Yeah, and some of them got smaller and some of them got bigger.
Yeah.
And I couldn't quite let go of the story back in 1913-14 about the suffragette character and her relationship with this mill. That felt really strong to me. And I went away and did various other things, including writing some radio plays. And I guess in the intervening time, I've written Call of the Undertow, Doubling Back.
Yeah.
But I started using the same setting to write some other short stories because, I did feel like short story was sort of my form, really.
Yeah.
And so, over the years I've added, but it still hadn't occurred to me to put them all together. I just saw them as discrete stories.
I mean, it's really curious the way you're describing it. It makes total sense. Having read this book, it's not a long book. What is it? It's 150 pages or thereabouts. And I mean, we can maybe come back and talk about this in more detail. But you could read it in a number of different ways. It seems to be either as a collection of short stories that are linked by the location that they take place in, or as a novel that's broken down into smaller pieces. I think it's an interesting, it's quite an unusual piece of work in that sense. But maybe we should start on now by just giving people a sense of what's going on. You mentioned the story of the suffragette and her relationship with this mill. So maybe it would be a good idea to start with a reading that brings her into focus.
So this is actually from a story. Each section has a title as if it's a short story. So this is called In and Out the Windows. And it doesn't need much introduction because this is the first time this character appears in the book. Come on, give me a keek of that husband of mine. What have you done with him then? I don't see him framed in his usual window, bent over the loom. I have to show him this, see, come in this morning's post. It's got a crest that my finger bumps over. A crest, aye, and it's addressed to me. To me. Maybe you don't hear me, with all that great rattling and jumping going on inside you, and the engine outside puffing and panting to keep up with the machines. Never as keen for a blether as me, eh? You've a face like a keekin glass today, all your watery eyes catching at the falling sun. Does it not make you feel a wee bit in danger, all that glass? But you've your bell towers to make you feel important, one for east and one for west, bringing the whole village to squeeze like a swarm of bees into that door and up your stairwell. Oh, aye, you're the rare wee tyrant. And I'm here waiting again on my bench, but I'm early today, right enough. I know them by heart now, your windows. 9 across the top floor, then 9 from right to left on your next, and so on to the bottom corner, 4 floors down. Counting's a fine way to pass the time, to take my mind off the cold chewing my fingertips. In and out the windows, in and out the windows, in and out the windows, 1, 2, 3. I know your lines and wrinkles too, by sight, if not by touch. Those patches of oil staining your stone to black. The wee curve made in the stonework at the top of each window. It's just how I've got to know the laugh lines of John's face. It's from staring into it each night by the fire, when we measure our fingers against each other's. Under his nails, there's the wool grease to scrape out. And under mine, the bannock dough, terrible stuff that sets solid like stone. It goes with this rattle. You hear? Aye, a box of matches in my apron pocket to show the proper wee country wife I'm becoming. We laugh about that in between talking about meetings I've been at, and women getting pelted with eggs and men's crude words for their trouble, all as if they were whores, not suffragettes. Aye then, play me your tune while I wait. Now, is it a jig or real? We've the looms two-stepping on the first 2 floors, and then the whir of the twisting frames above. But the spinning mule, there on the top floor, that's harmony, eh? Making its wee dance with the operative as they glide in and out. And there's the river all solemn and slow behind you, not seeming to mind what you steal from it for your lade. And the splashing wheel that turns and turns at the same speed all day, till I find myself inside it, my eyes dropping shut with the turn and splash, turn and splash. What a joke, eh, that we chose you instead of a ship to Canada. Glunchy old you, sat still and sour-faced. I could just picture myself, when I read the adverts, on a sleek, shiny new ship. I'd be the one stood at the prow, cutting through the waves, the first to spy the land of opportunities. We went down to the Clyde even, saw one of them away. Folk were cheek by jowl on the decks, greeting and waving, and the noise was rising off them across the water. And the hankies all like wee blossoms shaken about in the March wind. It's you that's our ship now. A big, square, grey stone ship. So, where is it we're sailing to?
Great, thanks very much. So this is Catherine,
This is Catherine.
and this is 1913, that
This is
first
in
extract.
13, yeah.
And she is already in that, she's an outsider. She's outside the building, addressing the building, and her husband John works inside there in the mill. And the way that you've just read that extract, we know that there's already a sort of there's a conflict already between her and the mill, and perhaps also what the mill's going to do to her husband over the course of the next months and years as well. So that's a really interesting story of those two people, and that threads its way all the way through the book, doesn't it?
Yes, and I think that's why the form is hard to identify, because there are clearly some stories which have actually been previously published as independent stories.
Right.
But when I came to put them all together, I didn't find that Catherine's story could be contained in one short story.
Yeah.
You know, and so because it's quite central to the meaning of some of the others, I felt that they, you know, actually you did need a sustained narrative for those. So that, I think that's what makes it difficult to say what the form is.
Well, I suppose I could push the metaphor a bit and say that there's a warp and weft in there, and that the Catherine John story is, whichever one it is, it's either the warp or the weft, but it's the thing that holds the other stories together, and they are sometimes going in a different direction from that particular story.
Yes.
It's the one story that, because you keep coming back to it between other stories, that you've got a real sense of it developing over quite a long period of time, and the relationship between Catherine and John changes in that time as well.
Yes, and her relationship with the mill changes because she's not allowed in because her husband's working in there. So the only time she was allowed in was when they came. This is his village. This is where he grew up. They'd met in the west of Scotland when she was working in a cotton mill near Paisley. He was a tweed weaver even then, but working in a mill there. And they'd met through both their kind of passion for the union movement, and were both apparently equally committed to women's suffrage as part of that kind of socialist vision. And it's this that sort of starts to be, once he's back in his home village with his family around, the sort of paternalistic values seem to...
Some of the principles get a bit compromised.
Yes, and he becomes part of the management of the mill. He becomes the foreman. So she's excluded, really.
But she's also the you've mentioned that she's got a letter with an embossed sort of bit on the front, and that's a letter that he needs to sign
Yes.
for anything to come of it.
Yeah, so she's looking for her own agency, basically.
Yeah.
She wants to train as a nurse,
Yeah,
but she, at that time, would have needed
her husband's
his
permission.
permission.
Yeah,
And the question is whether he'll give it.
yeah, yeah. And we shouldn't necessarily tell people who haven't read the book what happens, but it's intriguing because over the course of the book, a whole load of conflicts and stresses and strains come into that story, which is really fascinating. And one of the things I think was really interesting about reading this is, as I said earlier, it's a short book, and you're quite sparing. Your prose is very sparing in it. So, and I haven't added all the pages up of the John and Catherine story, but they're not that many. But you get a real sense of how this thing is developing and how he is, as I said, I don't want to give too much away, but how he is increasingly having to make decisions that put him and Catherine at odds with one another.
Yes, yes.
And the building is sort of playing its part in a slightly insidious way as well, isn't it?
That's certainly her interpretation,
Yes.
and so it becomes a kind of focus for her anger. This kind of staring at the face of the mill,
Yeah.
and it sort of starts off almost like a friend to her, and yeah, that changes a bit.
Yeah, and again, I think it's fascinating, because again, in that extract that you just read, there's a lot of references to stone. The mill itself obviously plays a huge part in the course of the whole book. It's a absolutely central character to the book. So you've got you've got human stories going on, but you've got at the heart of their stories, you've got this big building, this building hewn out of stone that's been there for quite a long time. And that is quite an elemental thing going on in the whole the book. I keep wanting to say novel,
Yes,
but
yes.
there's that whole kind of contrast between the sort of transient human stories and the fact that there's this great big permanent structure there right in the middle of it as well.
Yes, and really quite a small village as well, so it sort of dwarfed everything around it.
Yeah.
And I think the nature of the stone itself. I mean, I always had the notion that buildings do contain memory in their very fabric, and somehow stone will bear the memory of the human lives that have been conducted within it, but also, as you say, a sort of more primal geological memory as well.
Yes, I mean, the time framework of the book's really interesting because at one level it's about the life of the building, which is 250 years or something like that. But obviously the stone that the building is made of is much, much older than that.
Yes.
You get a sense, and we'll maybe come back to this later on, that actually you're talking about, you're trying to deal with quite big elements of the passage of time and how human life is really quite tiny and transient in the midst of these much bigger sort of epochs that are going on.
And I suppose by the end of the book, the human cycle of a building might seem relatively brief, really,
Yes.
in relation to the overall. It comes and it goes. Something which has seemed like a massive monument of geology actually isn't really.
Yes.
It's actually
And
quite
it's quite
transient.
ironic because here we are talking about a building and so on, and the concrete mixer is just the cement mixer is just started up outside because there's work getting done on the building that we're sitting in. And so maybe that's it's slightly ironic, but also perhaps not inappropriate that these little background noises should be going on as we're speaking. Maybe we should say a little bit about you. So the gestation of the book is a long period, and I find that really interesting as well because a lot of your how can I put this? You're not exactly prolific in the sense that you don't turn out a book every year, but I'm not saying that to criticism. I just think it's really interesting because I think it reflects the sort of nature of what you write and how you write. On your website, your own website, you've got a Susan Sontag quote, which I really like, which just says, "Love words, agonize over sentences, and pay attention to the world." And I get a very strong sense that you do that, and that you take your time when you're thinking about what a story might be, and also how to actually bring it to life and put it on the page.
Yes, I do. I do take my time, and I suppose I think of the process probably over the product, really.
Yeah.
And so, actually, being an observer of the world is probably first and foremost, and out of that, I expect some work to come and some not to really lead anywhere. So it's being alert to possibilities through observation, and I don't mean just observation of things, but observing things that people say, people's behaviour, things that feel true and important, which then may just provide the spark of something which grows. And I suppose I've got form on taking a long time because, doubling back, for example, my non-fiction book was started in 2007, and I'd got a full-length manuscript by the end of 2008, but it wasn't published until 2014 because I hadn't found the form.
Right.
I hadn't found the right form for all the content was there,
Right.
but I needed to find a book-type form. And, this is my 5th book, I think. And I've never had a publishing contract ahead of the completion of a book.
Right.
And I think that makes a difference because I'm not, I'm waiting for it to be finished before submitting it anywhere.
Which is quite a brave and risky way to go about writing.
Well, I think
but it's also realistic these days, of course.
I think it's also publishers haven't always been willing to take a gamble on something that's perhaps not quite cooked,
Well, this leads us on to the next point I'd like to talk about. I mean, because I have the same. In my opinion, publishers are very often not very imaginative and not very daring. And what a lot of publishers, not all publishers, what a lot of publishers want is somebody to say they've published a successful book by that author, and what they say is, "Great, can you give us another 6 of those?" And actually, that makes it challenging and difficult for a publisher with somebody like you, because you write different things and you don't necessarily say, "Right, I've done that, I'll do the same again and again." So the history of how this book actually came to be a book, to be published, is really fascinating. And the publisher is Taproot Press, and they are a very, very new outfit. And I just think the fact that this book kind of came out of the year of lockdown and COVID, and so did Taproot Press, is really fascinating. So I wonder if you could maybe just explain a wee bit to our viewers and listeners what that's all about, because I think it's a really interesting and actually I think quite an important story.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an incredibly brave thing to have done during this sort of year in which we've been sort of thrown off our normal course, to set up a publishing company. And the way it came about with Taproot Press was that Robert Allen Jameson, well-known Shetland poet and novelist, had COVID very early on. Yeah. And in his recovery, he wrote a sequence of poems. And I think with his son, they decided to publish them on a subscription model. Yeah. With friends and readers, sort of subscribing in advance to the book.
Going back to that kind of 18th century way of actually making sure that you could afford to publish a book. You get people to sign up for it in advance.
And they made such a success out of that, and of course realised in doing that they had to set up an imprint, and have ISBN numbers and that kind of thing, such that they thought they might as well keep going. And so Patrick and Danny, who are the
So Patrick is Robert Allen
Taproot's
Jimieson's son, and Dan is his partner. Yeah.
They put together Taproot Press, and they made a call out for submissions. And I looked at it because I had been following that story because I thought it was so amazing. And I looked at it and I thought, oh, they sound like they're describing this book. And so I thought, oh, well, it's worth a try. And I'd obviously begun to think of it as a book because I'd written the final story,
So you
which
did
was
think you
quite
had it
recent.
finished?
Yes, I thought it had a bit more of a shape, having brought the contemporary story much more up to date.
Right.
And I did deliberately put it the year before the pandemic started, so that I didn't have to bring that in. And anyway, their eye was caught by it because it sort of fulfilled. They were looking for unusual forms, for something with a bit of a political edge, and they loved it. So it was a match made in heaven, really.
So Taproot Presses, this is their second publication.
Yes.
And also, I mean, it's a beautiful, like Robert Allen Jimieson's Book of Poems, which is also a very beautifully produced hardback. This is a hardback. It's really lovely. It's a great object, and I think it actually, for me, it says that thing about why physical books are still going strong, and I actually have had quite a good year in the last year because as physical objects, they can be brilliant and lovely, but they're also a great piece of technology. Once you've got this printed and it's in your hands, you don't need any power. All you need is a bit of light, and you can read it, and it will stay like this forever.
Yes.
And it's a beautiful thing, and it's
a lovely
got
thing.
your handwriting on it.
I know. Yeah.
So they sort of like the idea that you would be involved in the design of the book.
Well, I mean, that was a funny thing how that came about, because they sent me an idea for the cover, and they'd used a handwriting font. And when I first looked at it, I thought, oh, that looks a bit like my handwriting. And so I said, oh, would you like to see my handwriting?
It's great.
And so they decided to use it.
That's great.
Yeah.
And so the chapter headings or the section headings are also in your handwriting, and it just adds a really really lovely dimension.
And of course
to
now
it.
it's out in an equivalent paperback, and with the same features.
Which is so it's gone from hardback, and then they reprinted the hardback, I think.
No,
they didn't.
No,
they didn't.
The paperback's the second edition.
But they exhausted the print run of the hardback in 3 months, which is fantastic.
Or 2 months, more or less. Yeah,
brilliant. It's great. It's a great success story. I think it's great for you, but I think it's an indication of how publishers, particularly perhaps new and younger publishers, are really having to be imaginative about the way that they find the readership that definitely exists for
and
the
I think
particular books
the sort of nimbleness of a small publishing outfit as well, that can sort of read the territory and find a really nice niche in that. So
no question. Yeah. But anyway, that's Taproot Press, which I highly recommend. Look out for their other and forthcoming books. But let's get back to the other side of Stone. Do you want to give us another reading?
Yes, from it? I'll read from the very beginning.
Okay.
Which I don't really need to introduce this because it is the very beginning of the book, but it's this story is called Stone Curse, and we're with the journeyman stonemason who begins the.
And this is when, roughly?
1831.
Okay.
So this is Stone Curse. Some days it's just the wee fella who watches me. I see him through the hazel arch of the workshop when I turn my head, and he's there when I take my tools out to the forge to be licked sharp in the flames. He perches on the top of the rubble pile or on a post and observes. A smart looker he is, with his white collar and chestnut stomach. Out of his dark face comes a scolding cry when there's someone coming. He's an unquiet bird then, with his clack, 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 for all as if he's bashing two stones together. If the women hear him, they turn their backs, pull their caps over their cheeks like blinkers, wondering who the rossard will fall upon. Will it be your father who wakes up blind? I tease them as they go by. Or your man that falls from a crag and loses the use of his legs? Or maybe the leg in between will drop off. It's not for a man of my age to be feared of a bird the size of my thumb. And the fellow's my friend, is he not? He's my steady companion, watching me force the chisel upon this rock that's so brute hard, my scours and draughts will be there to see for centuries to come. Other days, it seems I've got the whole village gathered about me, the Camerons and McGregors and McFarlanes. There's this rare excitement lighting up the place, the blether and rumours dashing between cottages. Folk flock about here, any time of day or night, quite bespelled by the thing clambering towards the heavens in steel and wood and stone. They whisper about the man on the horse, come from the south to build a new mountain in their midst, bringing wool spinners under the one pitched roof to make them all rich. Of course, we've heard of whole forests of machinery mills going up in the south, but to have such a thing here, all on its own, has them quite puffed up. The glamour of it's rosied their cheeks and has them bobbing and smiling when the man comes by to see progress. An awestruck hush comes upon them, save for those who've a few words of the English. He has a quiet way about him and a good smile, and they say he speaks of new markets and the fancy trade for trousers and protective checks for the estates. The minister tells me the man wishes to stop a trade as well as to start one. He has important business as far away as London, where he must join with other grand men to bring freedom to African people sold as slaves. As they've got used to me, the men have started to bring their whiskey and stories into the workshop. At first they stayed on their feet, but these days they each squat on a piece of rubble they've brought in from the pile. And I keep on with my work on the dressings, easing my stiff legs as I stretch to reach the whole length of the slab, taming it into smooth lines. It's to be the dedication stone above the door that holds the whole thing up. Archie's father dies, and then a cow dies, and the cow's really significant to them, and then the calf becomes unwell, and then Archie's younger brother, it's not looking too good.
So the stonemason knows this, and he decides to do something about it.
Yes.
Which is to basically try and find the Gleivstig a place
Yes.
to be put.
To be put and sort of concealed, and
And that's in the building.
yes.
And that's really fascinating as well, because that then suggests that there's a sort of possibly malevolent force or spirit that's actually embedded into the structure of the building, which is going to be there for a couple of hundred years, and which arguably does actually kind of make its presence felt later on in the story.
Yes. I mean, I think there's some sort of question of Catherine herself, that because she becomes quite an angry force. Is she in some way a sort of, I don't know, it's probably a little bit too strong to say that she's an embodiment of the Gleivstig, but there's some sympathy, if you like.
Yeah,
between,
she's angry for quite good reasons, really, isn't she?
Yes.
Again, without giving too much away, but she does eventually realize, she becomes really quite disenchanted with the mill.
Yes.
And the mill then becomes...
And her husband.
and her husband, yes. Again, for very good reasons. But then the mill itself enters into bad times, or times that are not nearly as good as they were. And I think that's, as the story, as the book progresses, you get an insight into other people who are working in the mill or are of it, who are finding it increasingly difficult to, for their lives to be productive there.
Yes. Yes. And of course, the tweed industry nearly sort of went into a total decline in sort of about 1910, I think.
Right.
And it was really the coming of the war which buoyed it up again, because there was a sudden demand for khaki and blues.
Khaki.
Yeah. And so, but coupled with that, we've got a period of incredible industrial unrest.
Yeah.
And that a mill on its own in Perthshire. The woolen industry was never particularly strongly unionised in Scotland, but an isolated mill particularly wouldn't have had, the workers wouldn't have had so much knowledge of
what was going on
elsewhere.
in the cities. Yeah.
And so they were very slow to unionise, or so they were a bit more vulnerable to, that sort of thing where suddenly they're minding 6 machines instead of 5 and without any increase in pay.
Yeah.
So they were very vulnerable to that kind of thing. And Catherine's furious about this because she's been involved in a very successful industrial action in the cotton industry and before she left Paisley.
Yeah. Yeah.
So she knows how that can work.
Yeah. But she's an outsider and she can't get in, and her husband is definitely by that stage an insider.
Yeah.
And we've already talked a wee bit about how this book, The Other Side of Stone, it covers the life of the mill, which is a couple of 100 years or maybe a wee bit more than that. But it's set in this much wider period of time, the age of the stone itself. And there are references to the life of birds, the time of birds and geological time. And towards the end of the book, you talk about the sort of life of the river that is, of course, absolutely crucial to the mill being able to function, and also about the coming and going of apple trees and fruit and so on. So there's a sense, against the backdrop of the industrial strife and the sort of clash of the workers versus the management, and of Catherine and her husband, their relationship being under such strain, that there is a sort of natural renewal and continuity going on all the time through the book as well, which I am hope I'm not reading too much into this, but that seems to reflect a lot of what you are specifically interested in as a writer. You spend a lot of time walking. Your non-fiction book, Doubling Back, the subtitle is 10 Walks Trodden in Memory. And I get a strong sense that some of the themes that are in that book are also in this book as well.
Yes, I think that's true, because I suppose my main themes tend to be place and memory.
Yeah.
And, that quite often there's this sort of, I tend to think of folklore as an aspect of place.
Yeah.
And so that quite often brings a sort of more ancient and possibly even slightly supernatural sense into that place. But also the resonances of memory. So in Doubling Back, it was a deliberate act of using my feet to retell a story.
Right.
And to sort of try and access a story, I suppose. Either a memory of my own or a memory of someone else or a group of people who'd travelled previously on that route.
The same route.
Yeah.
So your footsteps are sort of following in theirs, but it's also about bringing back.
It's sort of reclaiming stories, I suppose, through walking.
Yeah.
And it's something when I'm walking, sometimes I'm observing nature, but I've always been very animated by a sense of a path being ancient, trodden through time, and I think you feel it. I really do think that it's a feelable, tangible, feelable thing when you get on Drove Road and you're aware that there's centuries of.
There've been people going over that
with a purpose
for many years. Sometimes for hundreds or even thousands of years.
Yeah. And I find those kind of things fascinating.
Yeah.
And, so it's a great pleasure for me. I mean, to do that book was a great pleasure because it legitimised me sort of wandering about. And
do you think over the last year, when so many of us have been experiencing, something quite unusual, quite remarkable, the fact that we've not been able to go where we want to go, we've been having to rely perhaps on our imaginations quite a lot to get us through difficult times. Some of us, when we've been lucky enough to live in the right parts of the country or of the world, have been able to use walking as a way of getting through this period. Have you been doing a lot of walks?
Yes, I mean, I'm always walking, but I think probably it's been more important than ever. And one thing that's been interesting for me is that although I've lived in Aberfeldy for over 25 years, I think. My walking's been, fairly contained to that immediate area. I found new places. And it included, and this has been quite a discovery and one that I'm still exploring, some places that I never wanted to go because they're covered in forestry plantation, which is quite, it's quite a feature of the landscape, although there's wonderful broadleaf woodlands around, but there's quite a lot of plantation, which I've just thought it's dark and it's
not easy to walk through,
gloomy, and it's got tracks you can't see out.
Yeah.
But actually what I found really fascinating, I've followed some tributaries of streams, which are beautiful corridors because they were not plantable. So they're beautiful corridors of deciduous woodland and water, which only wildlife is really using. So that's one thing. And also looking at old maps and seeing where the old roads went, and they're often findable and they're still, a sunken path. It's almost like I can only describe it as being in an underwater world because it's as if it's concealed by this surface above. And I found that incredibly exciting. And I've been plotting various paths and some of the old firm tunes in the area using 3 words? I don't know if you've come across 3 words. So I've plotted them when I found things, features of old roads or piles of stones.
So the landscape that you walk through, that we all walk through, is actually layered with sort of along lots and lots of periods of human existence, and it's kind of there, waiting to be uncovered, or maybe not. Just maybe it's about just getting the feeling that there have been people there before.
Yes, I mean, I find it quite exciting, and I find a sort of sense of animation in the land from that as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I do get a strong sense that, and maybe we're going to hear about this in just a second, that some of those same ideas are at play in this book, which I still don't think I'm able to call it a novel.
No,
I don't think it's a novel. No, but it's so unusual, and it's so readable as well. And I think that the fact that it's a short book makes that readability even better. It's there's a lot in it. And although I've read it a couple of times, I read it quite fast the first time. The second time I read it much more slowly because I realised that there was an awful lot going on in almost every sentence.
Yeah, that's interesting actually, because quite a number of people have told me that they've reread it more slowly the second time. And I think because it's short, people don't mind doing that. But I think what's been really fascinating for me is to find how readers have received it, because it's like, I think Walter Scott said, was it Walter Scott who said, a writer only starts a book, a reader finishes it. Yeah. And that has felt very true with this, because it wasn't until I got that response initially from Taproot and then increasingly from readers that I actually believed in it, really.
I think that's absolutely true. I don't think any book is a two-way process, really, isn't it? And you do the work, you write it, but actually it's not until somebody else picks it up and reads it that the rest of the book is the rest of the purpose of the book, or the reason for the book's existence, actually happens.
And it's the active imagination in the reader of putting the fragments together.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you have to give a lot of trust to the reader in a book as fragmented as this, I think.
But it is repaid, and I think that's a good moment to ask you to read a little bit from towards the end of the book. And there was a couple of, if I can describe them as such, a couple of the stories that make up the tail end of the book I thought were absolutely brilliant and could have been standalone stories, but they're not. They're integrated into this. So you're going to read one more passage. Tell us a wee bit about what's going on, and then let's
just to go back to your last point. It was interesting that the two that you chose were the first one I wrote, which was Broken Symmetry.
Right.
That was the first one in the process about the young architect.
Yes.
And this was the last one I wrote. Which is The Other Side of Stone.
I didn't know that.
So that was quite interesting. So I'm going to read a passage from the final story, The Other Side of Stone, which takes place in 2019. And just to set it up a bit, because this isn't the beginning of the story, there's a young woman of probably about 16 from Perth who's a young carer of her mother, and she's not succeeded at school because of that, and she's now been sort of assigned onto an employment scheme in which young people are being taken around the villages of Perthshire to find old orchards and fruit trees and picking the produce, sort of in arrangement with the owners. So finding trees that have been neglected, really, that aren't, and the fruit not valued, and they're collecting the fruit and then using the produce to make preserves and juice and that kind of thing. And she's doing it fairly reluctantly, but this has taken her out to the village of the Mill, and she's been paired up with a lad from the village who's known as Bean, and she's just exhausted, really, and she just wants to kind of lie down and not do anything, but he's quite keen on these trees. Anyway, they go to the garden of a Mrs. Campbell, who's an older woman who's quite curious about what they're doing, and who turns out to have had quite a life as an artist. So we're going to join them when they've abandoned the tree in the garden and they've crossed the road and they've ended up on the ground where the mill had stood. And it's kind of overgrown now, but there are stones lying around. And the three of them have been sitting on a big slab. And they've discovered that Mrs. Campbell had been sitting on the inscription 1831, which the stonemason at the beginning had carved on it. Mrs. Campbell stood like a conductor, prodding her stick first at the rock, then tapping on Bean's arm. A bit of muscle, is there? Jade made sure she stood just out of reach. Just roll it over, the old woman said, pointing at the stone. Both stared at her. Why? Jade asked. Come on, get your young backs into it. Sake, Jade muttered. But they knelt down and scrabbled fingers into damp, sluggy grass, trying to get purchase. Bean found a plank of wood and wedged it under as a lever, and up it rose like a lid. Jade felt a tremor at what they were going to find there, treasure or a passageway or even a grave. And then the balance seemed to shift in the stone so that it took on its own life and rolled over by itself, leaving the underneath side facing upwards and a dark, earthy rectangle where it had been, straggled with white roots. A crowd of confused slaters scuttled away, seeking the dark again. Jeez. Brush it off so we can see. Bean used his sleeve to scatter clods of soil and reveal the new surface, smoother than the side they'd used as a seat. Now your turn, young woman. Jade's the name. Well, Jade, it's called frottage. You know it? Basic printmaking. You've got paper, haven't you? Soft pencil? B, 2B, 4B? Jade looked at her blankly until the old woman pulled a pencil from her own bag. Paper, she ordered. Put it over the marks there and then rub the lead over it. I've got to get the minibus. 1 minute it will take. Remember, there's a fag in it for you. Jade looked at the exposed face of stone. It would be good to have another smoke before the journey home. So she rubbed at the tendrils of greyish green which came off easily, and now saw a faint carved line, rubbed her sleeve across it, found 2 more. The 3 lines together formed a narrow triangle. There was more, but it was difficult to make out. Straight lines branching off each other like a tree. Shit, she said. Weird. She tore a page from her jotter and laid it over the carving. Then, with the soft pencil, rubbed furiously over the whole area. More appeared on paper than had been visible on the stone itself. A smaller triangle met the large one, tip to tip, and there were lines striking away from both. She held up the black, scratched page and then turned it so that at the top was the small triangle. 3 chips had been carved inside it. Hardly anything, and yet it was somehow obvious what it represented. Eye, mouth. It's a face, Jade shrieked. It's a fucking face. The rest of the figure now materialised around the face. A long, slim triangle for a dress, legs and arms made with simple chipped lines, and another set of lines radiating from the top of the triangular face. Hair. She held up the page in triumph as if she'd made the image herself. A figure in negative and weirdly alive. You could tell it belonged to someone you wouldn't mess with.
It's great. I love that story because Jade and Bean and Mrs. Campbell, there's a whole novel to be written about them as well, you know. And I love that moment because Jade has been, as you said, she's knackered from looking after her mother. She's grumpy. She really doesn't want to do anything. And there's that moment where she comes alive because suddenly she's recognised something in that stone, and it's a great moment. But I felt like, as I said, there could be an entire novel coming out of those characters of that situation. But there isn't, you know. Or I don't think there is. Maybe there is. But it's that there's that amount of detail in this small book, where there are all these lives that are going off at tangents to one another, and I just find that fascinating.
And I suppose that's the sense in which they are like short stories, and that there's always so much more imaginatively around a short story than is actually on the page. And so the reader's always dealing with some sort of ellipsis, really, and having to imaginatively fill in the gaps. But in this book, they're also having to fill in the gaps between the stories.
Absolutely.
So
and the stories are all connected by this building, which was there by the end of the book, is no longer there. It's a really fascinating piece of work, and I'm delighted that it's been so well received. And I encourage people, if they can't get the hardback anymore, they can get the paperback. The Other Side of Stone by Linda Cracknell. Thank you so much for
Thank you very
talking to
much,
us about
James.
On the edge of the West. Beneath the wilds of the Phanis, the Jiri, Bengola, Ullapool, Coorydin Sanctuary.
Where the skies rise further, where the heather scores the west, Summer Isles, Hebrides.
These houses painted white, a metropolis whose streets you can count on your fingers, and the pier, its tongue stuck out, licking salt from the air.
Here are friendly, welcoming people. Fish suppers are very black and white, flapping flag, silver sparkle, coconut broom.
Here, it's the scale of what blows through you as the wind burls the islands, sieving winter's thoughts from our heads.
And all along Market Street, the bloom of cherry blossom, making a Japan of Ullapool.